Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Greatest Games podcast on the Blizzard with me, Marcus Speller, and Jonathan Wilson. Today with us, we have James Copnall, presenter of Newsday on the BBC World Service and author of the book about the Sudans, A Poisonous Thorn in Our Hearts. James was previously the BBC's correspondent in the Sudans, also the Ivory Coast and Morocco. James, pleasure to have you on the pod.
Delighted to be here.
Today, we go back to the first match of the 2002 World Cup, which finished France 0, Senegal 1. James, why have you chosen this game?
First of all, just, the drama. France, world champions, European champions, kicking off the World Cup. Everyone was expecting a big win, and they lost, and Senegal won. And, that was an amazing start to a World Cup. And it hinted maybe that African teams were finally going to kick on and become a major force, and maybe it didn't quite happen. But as a game, as a drama, as a spectacle, it was extraordinary. And then very personally, I had lived in Senegal and I covered that team pretty closely. I was there, during the qualifying, Africa Cup of Nations that year and during the World Cup. And I had many Senegalese friends, even among, the players at the time, good mates, I suppose. And so for a very personal reason, it was an astonishing game. But I think everyone around the world was almost as astonished and delighted probably as I was, other than in France.
Yeah, Jonathan, it was quite the start to the tournament. And as a neutral, watching a game like that, that's what you want, surely.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd met James, I think, for the first time in Mali earlier that year at the Cup of Nations. And I sort of knew that Senegal team was a decent team. But you never quite know. And I think particularly with African teams, there's always questions in the build-up as to, are financial issues going to take over? What's the preparation been like? There's always extra complications there. So, they'd lost in the final on penalties to Cameroon in the Cup of Nations. They were clearly a really good side. I think in retrospect, it was my first Cup of Nations, but I think in retrospect, in terms of the quality of the teams there, it was probably the best I've been to, the 9 I've done. The football wasn't that great because the pitches were really poor. So it was an incredibly low-scoring tournament. But I think that's almost entirely down to just how bad conditions were. But you look at how good that Nigeria team were that ended up coming third, that Senegal beat in the semi-final, the Cameroon team who won it, plus the Senegal team. I'm not sure Africa's ever had 3 teams of quite that quality at the same time. And then, playing the world champions. So I guess similar to Cameroon beating Argentina in 1990, with the extra twist of it is against a former colonial power.
Yeah, that was absolutely massive. The build-up in a way was dominated by that, and then afterwards, that's what everyone could talk about. So I remember Moussa Jai, who played on the right during the game, and this was after the games in the hotel. He was absolutely knackered. He can't get off his seat, so he hadn't even eaten the post-match meal because he was just too exhausted. He's like, the cockle, that's the symbol of France, right? Everyone in Dakar's eating chicken. So he was happy. And it's the former colonial power thing was a massive part of it. And Senegal and France have a slightly, unusual relationship. It's the classic, there's bits of the classic former colonial power, former subject relationship and resentment and so on. But Senegal also had a very, very close relationship with France. So there were parts of Senegal in the colonial era where if you were born in Dakar or Saint Louis, a couple of other places, you were a citizen of France, as you weren't elsewhere in Francophone West Africa. And so the Senegalese were often seen by the rest of Francophone West Africa as very close to France, almost little Frenchmen in West Africa. And the Senegalese sometimes liked that description, sometimes didn't. So it's a sort of real kind of love-hate thing. Mm-hmm. But to beat the former colonial power at the start of the World Cup, the reigning, best team in the world, in front of the entire world, was pretty sweet for everyone, apart from those chickens.
I think that point about the relationship is a really interesting one, because there's an assumption it will be antagonistic, and the impression I got was it's not really as antagonistic as you may think. So I think of this squad, 21 were playing in France at the time. Yeah. A lot of them actually qualified to play for France. They'd grown up in France. Yeah. There was an interview Salif Diao did in The Independent with our friend Jacques Book, I think 2018, where he said in 98 he was going around watching France, supporting France. Yeah. So saying if Senegal hadn't been there, he'd have wanted France to win. So there's not quite the bitterness you might expect. It's a much more nuanced relationship than
definitely. And he wasn't the only one. Muslim Jai said exactly the same thing. Sporting France last time around, and lots of them, as you say, were born in France. Some of them discovered Senegal almost for the first time when they were called over for the national team. So they were people who had Senegalese parents but grew up in France. Maybe they'd been on holiday when they were 11 or something, and then they came back, and they were kind of, sometimes they were a bit like, whoa, what is this? This is not what I'm used to, which is not to say they didn't feel pretty Senegalese or represented their country as much as they could, but some of them had a very kind of French cultural frame of reference. And so, among the players, definitely quite a few who didn't have any ill will towards France at all. Perhaps among the Senegalese population, a bit more, the ones who hadn't had the advantage of a French education or growing up there, a touch more hostility. But a very, like you say, a nuance to the relationship. And then on the other side, you had Patrick Vieira, of course, who was born in Dakar, who in another world could have been playing for Senegal. But here he was playing for France. So he must have had slightly mixed feelings as well. So, of course, distraught that France had lost, but somehow an element of pride, presumably, that the other part of his identity, another part of his identity, had done so well.
James, of course, the Senegalese manager, or the manager of Senegal rather, was Bruno Metsu, Frenchman, of course, appointed in 2000. And he, one or two of the Senegal players said, it's important to the ones who, as you say, are familiar with France, but also familiar with Senegal. Obviously, very different countries, different cultures, different footballing cultures as well. And they spoke about some European managers don't sometimes get the more African footballing culture, the expression of the players and all that kind of stuff. Am I right saying he's quite a relaxed style of management, and he seemed to get the tone quite right in this?
Yeah, that was his moment of genius, I think, whereas the thing that really made it work was he was just incredibly laid back, and he wanted the players to be relaxed and laid back. And he knew that if he just told Hadji Diouf, I'm going to fine you for not turning up on time to training or whatever, then things weren't going to go well. But if you just let him, I'm taking a random example here, let's say. But, if you let Diouf go out to nightclubs 2 days before a big game, somehow it worked. At least there's an interesting debate here, because basically they were incredibly relaxed, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a second. And it worked up until they went out to Turkey. And then there were people in the camp saying, maybe we're a bit too relaxed. Maybe going out to nightclubs 2 days before the big game wasn't the best idea. But they went further than any Senegalese team in history, so it's difficult really to question it. But there's a sense of the players were encouraged to, I guess, take responsibility. It wasn't a sort of schoolmaster cracking down on them. He was incredibly sort of personally warm, I think, Metsu, which a lot of people appreciated. So to give you a really personal example, I was a young journalist, just got a year out of university or something like that, and I'd lived in Senegal a bit, and I knew they qualified for the World Cup, and they were going to play some pre-tournament friendlies late the year before, like November or something, in South Korea. And I flew out there, paid my own way, thinking I can do a few articles, cover the cost of the trip, help to build up my profile and so on. And so they played a game in, I forget where, Daegu or somewhere like that. And I was in the hotel afterwards, sort of doing a couple of interviews. I didn't actually have anywhere to stay. I was just going to try and find somewhere cheap nearby. And Metsu found out about this. And I knew him a little bit, obviously not, that well. And he said, I've got a couple of beds in my room, no one else in there. Come and stay in my room if you want. So I spent the night in separate beds, not stress, with Bruno Metsu. And I was just some young journalist. And there's a sort of sense of, can you imagine? I mean, Southgate maybe, but can you imagine Capello inviting a sort of 25-year-old English journalist who hasn't got much money to share his twin bed?
I could imagine Sven doing it, but yes.
Slightly different circumstances. So Metsu had this sense of, I'm not going to crack down on you. I'm going to be really open. And obviously, us journalists loved it, because you could turn up to the hotel at any time of day or night almost. And they tried to tighten up a little bit during the World Cup, but it didn't particularly work. So you could be, as I met other journalists at the time were, and perhaps Jonathan as well, in the sort of corridors of the hotel with the guys playing djembe drums, the day before a game at sort of 10:30 after their dinner or whatever, just talking and drinking tea and all that sort of stuff. And it wouldn't probably work for a lot of teams. A team like, let's say, England has so much media pressure and people swarming on them. And actually, the number of people interested in swarming onto the Senegalese team site at that time wasn't that high, because no one really particularly knew they were before the game against France, who these guys. And perhaps after the game against France, they had to tighten it up a little bit. But that sort of sense of, we just want people to enjoy themselves and we're going to be laid back and relaxed, I think probably relaxed the players. And then allied to that, and we'll probably get into that a bit later, there was a sense of tactical sophistication and sort of discipline that they had, that people perhaps wrongly don't often associate with African teams. But it wasn't just a bunch of laid back guys heading out to party and doing whatever they pleased. They were very good footballers who played in an extremely disciplined and tactical way. But yeah, Metsu's approach was a big part of that. And I still remember rereading a couple of pieces before this, like a bit from a press conference where a Korean journalist asked Metsu to explain the length of his hair in relation to the success of his team. Everyone, so the madness of a World Cup, like how are you meant to possibly answer that? I don't even recall what he said, but he was a pretty laid back guy. So he just,
I'd imagine he gave it a go.
Well, it should be said, Metsu had quite long curly hair. He had sort of
very long hair. Exactly. It wasn't a buzz cut. So it was a compliment, I guess we'll say.
Yeah. I mean, the example of that relaxation I remember. You might have been there that night. Actually, I'm not sure, but I was just in a bar in Bamako during the Cup of Nations in 2002, and there was a load of South African journalists there, and drinking quite heavily. And significantly after midnight, a bloke turns up with quite a heavy French accent and says in English, "Do you mind if me and my girlfriend join you? I just want to practice my English." We're like, "Yeah, of course." And he buys us round, and he's not drinking beer. It should be said, he's drinking that sort of pink fruit syrup thing that is very popular in West Africa. And well, it's not alcoholic, whatever it was. I'm not concerned. And then probably about 4:30 a.m. he sort of stands up and goes, "Oh, that's been lovely. Thank you very much. I better go. I've got training in the morning." Who are you? And it was Caroline Fidigo. And I just, I hadn't recognised him because he was, he was. I think he was wearing a suit jacket and a t-shirt. And it just never occurred to me he might be a footballer. Because why would a footballer be joining us at 1 a.m.?
Yeah, absolutely. But Jonathan, that Africa Cup of Nations that you mentioned there in 2000, Senegal, it was the first time they'd reached the final in their history.
2002,
2000, sorry, forgive me. And what did you think of the side then? So you got a bit of you saw them then, because going into the World Cup, I think they were the lowest ranked side at the tournament, or out of all the 32 nations. But clearly they'd done well in the African Cup of Nations that year, and got a very warm reception when they went home back to Senegal.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it was hard to assess them just because the pitches were so bad. So the football in that tournament was not good football. The event was amazing. I had a fantastic time there. Mali was an incredibly welcoming, interesting place. The access to teams was great. I mean, again, talking about the relaxation. I think there was 2 groups in Bamako, so there was 8 teams in Bamako, and 7 of the teams were in the L'Amitié Hotel, which is this sort of concrete monstrosity built by the Soviets in the centre of town. And Senegal were the only ones who weren't, who were in this sort of quite pretty hotel with a nice garden. So, I mean, you could grab players wherever, but going to the Senegal hotel was a bit nicer because you could sit in this nice garden rather than in this sort of quite soulless Soviet-style hotel. But it had become apparent. I mean, certainly that game against Nigeria in the semi-final, it was apparent that, this is actually a properly good team. And the thing that was striking then, if you look at the goals they scored in that tournament, they only scored 6 goals in the tournament because, as I say, a very low-scoring tournament. But of those 6, 4 of them came after the 80th minute. So they were physically a very fit team. I think a very well-organised team as well. But to be honest, I think it was only in retrospect I sort of really appreciated how good they'd been. I was a bit sort of unconvinced by everybody just because of the conditions.
Okay, chaps. Well, let's go and take a quick break. And then after that, we will talk about the match itself. Back in a moment, everybody. Welcome back to the Greatest Games on the Blizzard. Right then, gentlemen, so the match itself, opening game of the World Cup, of course, as I mentioned in the first half, Senegal, lowest ranked side going into the competition. France, of course, the champions, the world champions and European champions. I mean, you could argue that one may argue that they were even better in 2000 than they were in 1998. Put all that together, James, and the fact that 5 days before that game, there was a controversial incident where some of the players went into a jewelry shop and Diouf had dared Fadiga to steal a necklace, which he then produced on the team bus sometime later, and the South Korean police would come in and question this. You put all that together and it would usually, if you crunch the numbers, would suggest a very comfortable France win, James.
Yeah, it really would. I think on that incident just before the tournament started, I think everyone was a bit shocked. It was Fadiga. I mean, Jonathan, you were talking about your chat with him. He was a really thoughtful guy. I think he did speak pretty good English for someone who is his second language.
He learned from the best, clearly.
Exactly. And he would not be the person. He was a joker. He did enjoy having fun, but he would not be the person you would imagine getting involved in that sort of thing. And it was all sorted out. There were charges. The shop, I think, gave him a little other piece of commemorative good luck jewelry before the game. But it really cast a pall over it. And there were people in Senegal who were just utterly, friends of mine, distraught, because this was Senegal making its name or projecting its name around the world. Lots of people didn't particularly know where Senegal was, much about Senegal. Here they are in the headlines to play the opening game, and they've got this scandal to deal with. So that was a really difficult way to begin the tournament. And then you get to the game, and as you say, everything's against Senegal. And I think Trezeguet had been the top scorer in Italy, and Henry had been the top scorer in France. And Senegal had up front Hadji Diouf, who was very talented, but I think he'd scored 10 goals the previous season at last. He was not a prolific goal scorer. He had been in qualifying. He didn't score a goal in this World Cup, though. And you're thinking they're going to get annihilated. And they didn't. And Diouf was absolutely magnificent. And my predominant memory of him in that game is him being caught offside. It felt like about 78 times. It can't have been quite as many as that. And I haven't been able to confirm that on the highlights package because they tend to show people getting caught offside. But he just scared the hell out of the French defenders. They were constantly nervous. I think Leboeuf wasn't the quickest by that stage. And if you look at the goal, Omar Daf wins the ball back, and they get the ball very quickly to Diouf, and he just skips past Leboeuf, who just doesn't have the pace or the energy to keep up with him. And then it's a bit of a scramble, and bounces off Barthez, and Bouba Diop sort of hooks it in. It wasn't the prettiest goal, but the pattern of that French defensive line not really being able to cope with Diouf, and to a lesser extent Fadiga, have been set, I think. And France had a couple of chances. They hit the post, and they early on Henry hit the bar as well. But my dominant emotion, I'm interested to hear what Jonathan thinks, but being in the stadium and frankly, although I'm a Francophile, I was absolutely willing Senegal to win and screaming quite loudly when they scored, which wasn't the most professional thing to do in a press box, but I was young, forgive me, was that actually they weren't in that much danger, that it was a sort of not a particularly threatening performance by France. They changed their formation, I think, just before the tournament. I think they'd been largely in, Jonathan may correct me, but they were largely in a sort of 4-4-2 in the Nations Cup. And then they went into a 4-5-1 just before this tournament. So they had three pretty tough defensive midfielders, Bouba Diop, Salif Diao, Aliou Cissé, Fadiga on the left, who's the most creative of the midfielders. And then for the game against France, they played Moussa Ndiaye on the right, who was very physical and great runner, very strong, but not incredibly creative. Later on in the tournament, they play Henri Camara up there, and he was much more of a goal threat. But they just obviously planned to nullify France and then hit them on the break. And that's where, Fadiga's through balls and Diouf's pace really came into play. But they were very, very disciplined. Tony Silva, who hadn't played regularly at all, had a fantastic game in goal. And it was a shock. It was a surprise. Obviously, the weaker team won, but I don't think I don't think you could say they didn't deserve it. I think over the course of the game, they absolutely did.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, there's that the Trezeguet chance early on, wasn't there?
Yeah,
Henri
could have changed it all, maybe. Yeah,
and that was where you saw, this is happening as we expect. But then there's this sort of sense of, well, hang on, they're not breaking through them. And I think that use of Njai on the right to block in Lizarazu, that really affected France, because Thuram obviously doesn't get forward as much on the other side. And so they became, I think, very sort of predictable. There was a lot of passing in front of that line of three holding midfielders. So France was playing sort of a 4-2-3-1 with Henri coming off the left. And he didn't really get into the game in the way that he might have done. There was no space there for him to use his pace to attack. Trezeguet similarly couldn't get behind the Senegalese back line. And then, we mentioned France thinking it would work twice. Well, Fadiga also hits the bar with the score 1-0, which is, less than a minute before Henri hits the bar. So yes, it could easily have been 2-1 to France, but equally it could have been 2-0 to Senegal. And there was a sense of France just sort of running out of steam really early. And it was only, I think, sort of in the weeks that followed, we realised that things had gone pretty badly wrong in the French camp. In the classic French way, if they're not winning the tournament, they're deconstructing themselves magnificently. And it wasn't quite 2010, but it wasn't far off. And of course, they go on to draw against Uruguay when Henri sent off. And Henri, for various reasons, there's all kinds of rumours about that. But get Philippe Auclair on a night out and he'll tell you what was actually going on, but we can't really talk about that now. And why Henri was in so despairing of the rest of the squad. And then they get beat by Denmark in the final game and so go out in the group stage, which is world champions, as European champions, was the humiliation for them. But obviously in this game we didn't know that, and perhaps if they'd won this game it wouldn't have happened. But you're right, I think once Senegal had scored, there was a sense of France were being held at arm's length, and it wasn't sort of a siege of kind of hundreds of shots in the last 10 minutes. It was actually relatively comfortable.
I think you probably should say as well they were missing Zidane. I think that was a big factor, wasn't it? Had they had Zidane, it might well have been different, but it wasn't. And I think the way Senegal went on from that tournament showed that they were a pretty good team, going behind against Denmark, and then they scored. I thought one of the goals of the tournament, that sort of 80-meter counter attack that Salif Diao finished off, sort of 4 or 5 players involved and back heels and first time passes and so on, and then drawing 3-3 with Uruguay and beating Sweden. They were a good team who were able to adapt to different circumstances, play their way different. There was a line at the tournament, I think it was probably Simon Cooper, who wrote that they were a team of sort of along the lines of jobbing League One professionals, not much more than that. And I thought that was probably a little bit unfair. I think none of them were sort of superstars. People had hopes for Diouf, and it obviously didn't quite happen that way. But he was a very talented player, if not a global superstar.
You got on quite well with Diouf, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. He was, if you were to write down a list of, if someone who really knew him wrote down a list of the not great things he'd done, I suspect it would be quite a long list, maybe, and people he'd annoyed along the way. And yet everybody loved him. There's something very endearing about him. Big smile. I think he wanted to be loved by everyone, from journalists to the entire Senegalese nation. And he had a captivating way about him, but also very, he usually he taught himself to talk in sort of very boring cliches, as loads of footballers, particularly at the time, did, I think, didn't they? He didn't want to say anything too sort of controversial, but he couldn't really help himself. So the one seems like, I've got to try the exact quote. It's something like, on va faire chier tout le monde et make everyone shit themselves, literal translation. It's a little politer in French. And, he would just kind of, could be.
Hang on, doesn't that quote go on and fuck the entire brothel? Isn't that the end of that quote?
That is the one. I didn't know if I could say it, but
yeah, fine.
Well, bordel partout, which is fuck the brothel everywhere. Literally, it's not as rude as that in French, really. But the bordel is like chaos. It's so it's basically we're going to annoy everyone and create chaos. But it's the sort of thing that if you're your media training manager would have it in their hands at that point. And you sort of had to love that with Diouf, I think, because he just would do it with this big smile, and even the people who were annoyed with him would somehow end up loving him.
But James,
I mean, my sort of, I mean, very similar sort of. You obviously knew him far better than I did, but my memory that it fits exactly with that description of him. Were you in Egypt in 2006? So did you go out to, was it Ismailia, that place on the Red Sea coast where Senegal were based?
No, I don't think I did.
It was a nightmare to get to. It took forever to get there. And we got there late because it was much further than anybody or much harder to get to than anybody had appreciated. So I don't know, 4 of us eventually get there, having sort of driven like 2.5 hours in a cab. And we get there, and we'd agreed to meet them before training, and training had begun. But there was sort of, you can probably grab them after training. So Ferdinand Colli said, yeah, no worries, I'll talk to you, fine. And then we got Diouf, and he was in a really bad mood. Something obviously happened in training to annoy him. And he hadn't showered or anything, so he was still dripping with sweat in this bar in this training complex. And he clearly didn't want to be there. And he was giving these monosyllabic, very dull answers. And eventually somebody said, look, come on, we know you're a good talker. Just say something and you can go. You don't have to say it. Say something interesting now and you can go. And he went, okay, the wrong African teams have got to the World Cup. It's going to be an embarrassment for the continent. Thank you.
Amazing. What's his background, James? When you talk about this character who's rubs people up the wrong way, and but yet he's very likable and quite charismatic. What are sort of the talking points of his story then that's gone into creating him?
I mean, I think he grew up in relatively tough circumstances in the north of Senegal. He played in this thing called the Navetan, which is like a seasonal tournament, related to the harvest season, which sounds very sort of rural, but it's not really. It's kind of traditional Senegal, and it's like neighbourhood football. My neighbour has a team, your neighbour has a team, best guys come together. It's intensely sort of competitive. And he kind of made his name in that, I think. And there's probably the element of the difficult background, not having that much as a kid. He was just desperate to be a star, I think, probably. And, the wealth and adulation that went with that. And luckily for him, he had a lot of talent. So it got him pretty far. Maybe it didn't get him as far as he would have liked, but it took him an awful long way from where he started. But I don't think you can entirely explain everything by background and circumstances. Mm-hmm. People grew up in similar circumstances. He's just something of a one-off, I think. A blend of charisma and neediness and talent. Because he did give those French defenders the runaround. There's no doubt about it. And in qualifying, he's the major reason Senegal got to the World Cup in the first place. He had back-to-back hat-tricks, 8 goals in 5 games at one point, key goal against Morocco. They just simply wouldn't have been at the World Cup, which they'd never looked like getting to previously, had it not been for him. And although in a lot of ways Senegal didn't properly capitalise on 2002, I think you could probably argue that they are a bigger, better footballing country now because of it, just because agents and recruiters and others pay attention to Senegal, and there are more football academies now, more conveyor belt of people going to France and other places, and there's a sort of greater depth of talent that they can call upon. So the after 2002 period could have been more successful, but I think it still laid the foundations for a much stronger footballing country, and Diouf was really at the heart of that.
Yeah. Jonathan, we've mentioned a few players who obviously were in the side who beat France that day. One we should mention is Aliou Cissé, the current Senegal manager, of course. He was excellent at the back, the captain of the side, and that commanding and calm presence was rather important.
Yeah, and a great organizer. I mean, we talked about those 3 holding midfielders. So he was the central one, running slightly deeper than Diop, and remind me who was the other one? Jatta. Salif Diao, sorry, yeah. And I think since he's become a manager, you see, his intelligence and his game intelligence. He was incredibly impressive, I thought, in Egypt in 2019 when Senegal obviously got to the final again, came so close, and he's just smart. He's just one of those people who gets it, and he gets it both from a footballing point of view of how to organise a team, but also he knows what to say in public. He knows the right things to do to calm situations or to inflame situations if they need inflaming. He's just really, really smart guy, and hopefully, as and when he leaves Senegal, he will get his chance in Europe, which has always been a huge problem for African managers.
Yeah, and James, also in this Senegal side, you had Papa Bouba Diop, of course, who would go on to play in the Premier League, and he got the goal. How important was he to this Senegal side?
He was extremely important. I thought he was a really, really good player. He's so big, massive guy, but he had great feet. That's a cliche, isn't it? Good feet for a big guy. Sorry.
but it was true of him.
But it was true. What can I do? So, if you looked at that midfield, Ali Cissé spent a lot of his career at centre half, and he became a pretty good sort of organising defensive midfielder, but he wasn't particularly good with the ball at his feet. And Salif Diao wasn't bad, but Bouba Diop was definitely the one who could play the most. And also, he would get forward and he would score goals. So he had 3 in the World Cup. Again, Diouf didn't score. Henri Camara got a couple against Sweden. Hadji Diouf scored. But the main goal threat was this young, very quiet, very shy, but absolutely massive, very, very skillful central midfielder, Bouba Diop. And I think everybody loved him. And he was someone I thought who might have had a slightly bigger career than he did, in a way. I think perhaps there were periods where that sort of immense size would have been more of an advantage than in the period in which he played. I'm not sure. Or maybe he just wasn't quite as good as I thought he could be. But he always, I think, played very well he always came up big for Senegal when it mattered, and none bigger than scoring the goal against France in the opening game of the World Cup.
Well, I think there is an argument that, and it feels almost like flippant to say it, but when he died, I wrote a piece saying this, that moment, that goal, to a global audience, is probably the most famous moment in Senegal's history.
Yeah,
now, I'm not suggesting it's the most important moment, because obviously there's huge numbers of political things going, cultural things going back centuries. But in terms of a thing that happens that people all around the world were watching and remember, that goal, it must be the most famous moment in Senegal's history, which is an astonishing power and responsibility that footballers have.
Yeah. Also, we've got to talk about the dance afterwards, because it's sort of a mix of, I think, Morris dancing and pelvic thrusts, if you can imagine that. Coordinated, 8 or 9 of them there. Bouba Diop took his shirt off, didn't he? Chucked it down. So that went around the world as well. So that was
nice. I mean, it is lovely sort of looking back at the Senegal side, because, I mean, they were really rank outsiders going into the tournament. And it's true, they put their country on the map. It's certainly in a footballing sense. And they would go on, to the quarterfinals. They drew with Denmark, Uruguay, beat Sweden with a golden goal. And we talked about Metsu's relaxed approach and the relaxed approach in the camp, but according to the article in The Independent written by Jack Pitt-Brooke, the president of Senegal was unhappy about all the openness and the good times, if you like, that were happening in the camp, and he sent a special envoy to the team base to tighten things up, shall we say, from this approach. And the players were apparently confined to their rooms on their own for large parts of the day. And certainly in this piece, Salif Diao said that this resulted in them being emotionally drained ahead of the quarterfinal, and the good feeling had kind of been sapped from them. James, I mean, did you notice this? Did you sort of witness this?
I didn't know about the intervention of the president at the time. I mean, that was fascinating reading about that a couple of years ago. There was a slight sense, I think, of increasing tension as the expectations grew. They got the whole way to the quarter-final, and if you're an African team, you're going to, in that situation, you're going to be constantly hearing, "Are you going to become the greatest team ever, first African team to make the semi-final?" And then obviously, can we win it? Could we? So that sort of level of, I think, pressure was mounting, and there was an attempt probably to make this camp a little more like a traditional football team, a little less open, and perhaps that didn't go down too well for players. But I think there were probably, lots of factors. I think they were probably quite exhausted emotionally, perhaps, as well as physically. I mean, look, it was a golden goal against Turkey, right? I mean, that's a game that could easily have gone either way, and then they are in the semi-final. Turkey were a pretty decent team, if not world-beating team at the time. It was no shame, I think, in losing to them. I think to this day, some of these players probably feel that they should have beaten them. They should have gone that little bit further. I think they're probably unlikely to have actually win it. But yeah, sort of the image of Senegal going round. I mean, Abdoulaye Wade, who was president at the time, might well have not liked this idea of these, happy-go-lucky, crazy guys having a party in South Korea and Japan, but he was pretty keen to, bask in their reflected glory when they came back to Dakar and, meet the team, travel through the centre of the town with them. Was the entire population of Dakar turned out to welcome them. So he can't have been too upset about it, the image they portrayed.
I think it does feel, I mean, this isn't really fair in Senegal, but it does feel like a missed opportunity. Still only 3 African teams have reached quarterfinals. And you think this was the one where actually they should have gone on. I mean, Cameroon against England in 1990, actually, you could easily have won that game. And Ghana obviously very nearly beat Uruguay. But England and Uruguay were better teams than Turkey were in 2002.
Yeah.
And also, I think 2002, for a whole number of reasons. I mean, that was a tournament that began on the 31st of May. It started earlier than any previous World Cup study, any World Cups in my lifetime. The fact it was the first season,
isn't it?
Yeah, not far off these days. Yeah. The fact that it was the first season where you had the second group stage in the Champions League, saying a lot of players were tired. We mentioned Zidane not being there. Pires was also injured. There's a couple of other high-profile absentees. Beckham obviously had the whole metatarsal nonsense. Not that I think England were really in with Shatter winning that one. But there was an opportunity there for an outsider to really go a long way. Well, as Turkey did and South Korea did. But that could have been Senegal. And you sort of sense now that it's sort of like Western Europe's being kicked into gear, that there's this sort of industrialization of the production of youth talent that over the last 16 semi-finalists in the World Cup, 13 have been European. It now feels like a Western European tournament in a way that 20 years ago, it felt like it was becoming decreasingly a Western European tournament. So you do fear that Africa's moment has passed, or the rest of the world's moment has passed, and Senegal were the one who had the real chance.
Yeah, well, we never know what Qatar could bring, but one thing.
Southgate's glory, Marcus, you know that.
Beating Senegal in the final, maybe that's right. But one of them has to lose on penalties. What I would also like to thank the Senegal side for is kickstarting the very strange phenomenon in the 21st century of all but one of the world champions being knocked out in the first round of the following tournament. It's such an France 02, Brazil 06 are the only ones who have bucked the trend, but Italy 2010, Spain 2014, Germany 2018. So to me, that's their legacy. And I thank them for that enormously. But of course, they were the side that put their country on the football in that, James. And it's been fascinating talking to you about this team, and a very, very fond memory in the annals of time with regards to the World Cup. So thanks very much for coming on to the Greatest Game. It's been a pleasure.
No, my pleasure. I loved it.
For more stories like that, do check out theblizzard.co.uk, everybody. But Jonathan and myself will be back next week with another great game from the history of football. See you then.